Jimmy Holmes is a man who has captured the imagination of those intrigued in the shady world of organised crime in Britain, London in particular. He is one of just a handful of genuine faces to have spoken out about his time in the criminal underworld, anonymously, but has since been identified after the original interview given to a TV production crew in 2006. Unlike the Blundells and others who have gone public about their crimes, the so-called avant-garde gangster has never attempted to portray himself as misunderstood or downplayed the severity of his crimes, though understandably for a man in this position, he is not disclosed to the extent to which he was involved in certain crimes and never publicly revealed the identity of his partner, who we all know of today. His book, Judas Pig, captured the public's eye as they read about the exploits of Billy Abrahams and his psychotic partner Danny Longshanks. Widely accepted to be a variation of true-life events, his words were as close to a real-life account of his time as an organised criminal in the 80s and 90s as we may ever get. In this episode of London Uncovered, we'll be examining Jimmy Holmes, what he wrote in Judas Pig, and what we know about the man himself. We'll be analysing the publicly known information about him and exploring his current status. It is unknown if this man is dead or alive, and if he is alive, where he is. This is the colourful, fascinating man whose story is at times unbelievable in the context of the world he lived in. You're watching London Uncovered, and this is Who Really Was Jimmy Holmes? Jimmy Holmes was born in 1959 in South East London, growing up in Bermondsey. His mother's maiden name was believed to be Mayher. She was of Irish descent, whilst his father was of Jewish origin. Billy Abrahams has the Star of David tattoo on his upper arm, so it's probable that Jimmy Holmes has this tattoo in real life. It remains to be seen what his associates in Canning Town would have thought of a Jew in their firm. Canning Town was never exactly a hotbed of racial tolerance. It is even more thought-provoking as to what they would have thought of not just a Jew, but a gay Jew on their firm. Jimmy Holmes was a gay man. Whilst this revelation may have surprised and continued to surprise many, it is not unheard of for men in organised crime to be gay. Both Cray twins were reported to have been gay or bisexual. One of the most difficult things you could probably ever read was Jimmy Holmes' account of being sexually molested as a young child by a paedophile in a South London toilet, detailed in Judas Pig. It is unknown as to how much this incident contributed to his life of crime, though evidence suggests that victims of sexual abuse can go on to have numerous difficulties in their life aside from those relating to sexuality. It is known that Jimmy was a drug user, predominantly using cocaine, and drug use is often used by survivors of such abuse in later life to deal with such immense trauma. Whether or not this incident contributed to Jimmy becoming gay is unclear. The disturbingly casual and blasé manner in which the incident is described is remarkable. For Jimmy, it appears that this abuse has almost been normalised for him. We know that Jimmy harboured great resentment against paedophiles as a result of this incident. He worked in Soho, long known for its vice, and would often beat up men who attempted to source pornographic material of children. It could be argued that there are two types of major organised criminals who the public hears about, either the leaders of gangs and groups, the David Hunts, the Terry Adamses, the Curtis Warrens, or the enforcers. The enforcers are at the front line of organised crime. If organised crime is viewed through a business lens, a fair comparison considering the sophistication such organisations usually have, the heads of crime syndicates like the Hunts, the Adams, the Kinahans, etc. are the CEOs, whilst the enforcers are managers. Jimmy Holmes was an enforcer, and like so many enforcers, their loyalty changes depending on which organisation hires them. Holmes was initially working for a South London family, the Frenches, as well as being under the mentorship of Bernie Silver, an East End Jew, who was the leader of a prostitution racket which became known as the Syndicate. At its peak between 1967 and 1972, most of the Met's Vice Squad were in its pocket, and it controlled roughly 19 of the 24 strip clubs in Soho. Jimmy was an enforcer for Silver. Silver encouraged Holmes to invest in the East End. An opportunity arose when a proposition was made to him by long-time South London villain Ronnie Olive, another face in the porn industry. Olive's proposition was for Holmes to invest in a Canning Town gym which wasn't making money. The owner of this gym, David Hunt, then an up-and-coming young man in Canning Town who was the leader of the Snipers, a vicious gang which predominantly carried out armed robbery, lorry hijackers, as well as being linked to the National Front. Holmes and Hunt met and agreed to convert the building into a massage parlour on the first floor and a hardcore porn cinema above. The existing gym was to be retained for use by local villains, Hunt and Holmes included, for them to bond over their love of weightlifting. The two men had some shared interests, but also had some very different personas. Jimmy was outgoing, whereas Hunt was something of an introvert. They both had a love of violence and also shared an interest in pigeon racing, with Jimmy's uncle having been one of the best pigeon racers in East London, which impressed Hunt. It was Holmes who passed on the skills that Silver had taught him to Hunt, who lacked the financial skills and ability that Holmes had. The self-proclaimed avant-garde gangster was snappy, well-dressed and confident, representing a new kind of pan-London villain who had the foresight to view the imminent demise of armed robbery in favour of drug importation. Holmes and his associates began to supply ecstasy to the growing rave scene in Essex and East London, whilst also importing cannabis and cocaine. Eventually, the law caught up with Holmes. It was not for the more serious offences he was indicted in, but rather mortgage fraud. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 30 months behind bars at Ford Prison on the south coast. Whilst incarcerated, Holmes appreciated the time away from the blood-soaked streets of Canning Town, away from the constant violence and his own partner. However, he was soon delivered some shocking news by a fellow East London inmate. Hunt had just bought a new home, the Morleys, out in Great Hornbury on the Essex-Hertfordshire border. This revelation would form something of a tipping point for Holmes, as he believed Hunt had used the money from various robberies and deals owed to Holmes to instead fund his new home worth £600,000. A point of contention between the two men would ultimately result in the end of their partnership. It centred around the leasehold of a property, 2 Greens Court, in Soho, which was up for sale. The leasehold was for sale for some £200,000. Hunt had £100,000 lined up, whilst Jimmy said he was working on his finances. He planned to take the £100,000 and run, but then an opportunity arose for even more money when Skinny Gary, an armed robber turned drug trafficker, offered his services to Hunt in return for laundering his money through the business activities of the Hunt syndicate. Jimmy took Gary under his wing, but then learned that Hunt planned to rip Gary off at the next drug deal. Jimmy wanted to get there first to take his money, but before he could implement this daring plan, he got cold feet. He went on a 2-week bender, locking himself in a Brighton hotel room, getting high on his own supply. Jimmy had financial interest in Brighton through a gay bar that he was opening. Armed with a shotgun, he planned to kill Hunt if he came to the door, but as it transpired, the only people who came to the door were his dealer and the pizza delivery man. Suffering from depression and in the midst of a nervous breakdown, Holmes eventually returned to his associates in the East End. Sitting in the back of the Hunt brothers' car and listening to them talk about a new recycling plant deal, Jimmy told them, "Yeah, that's right, you're a proper man, and everyone's a cunt who isn't from Canning Town and doesn't think that you're the dog's bollocks. You're a psychopath. You enjoy hurting people. You get a kick out of it. I know how you are when you're going to do someone. You're quiet, and then that ghostly white face of yours when it's done. You couldn't wait to push me off to the others, always going on about fags. Why do you hate them so much? Maybe there is something in there that makes you hate yourself so much." Putting a Beretta against the back of the long fella's seat, Jimmy considered pulling the trigger, but couldn't, believing psychologically Hunt had beaten him. He told himself he would get himself together, in a better place, before taking out Hunt. Meanwhile, the deal with Skinny Gary came good, and Holmes collected the £100,000 that he had asked Hunt to put forward for the freehold, made up of 5 £20,000 cheques. He stayed in a hotel whilst waiting for them to clear. Holmes decided he would leave Canning Town and Britain for the land of the free, settling in a small coastal town in Southern California. He put Gary Oxley, a man who managed Holmes' pawn empire in Soho, in charge of his operations whilst he was out of the country. Whilst in California, he made Hunt a final offer via Gary Oxley. For £1,000 a week, a fifth of the income from the brothel and sex shop rents, Holmes said he was willing to manage the West End properties, but signed them over to Hunt on paper.
"Tell that cunt he's not even allowed to enter this country."
Hunt had manipulated Gary Oxley into changing sides, handing over Holmes' paperwork for the offshore companies that controlled the leases. He had been unable to intimidate Bernie Silver, a man who had seen off the craze and was certainly not scared of the long fella. Via a property lawyer, Hunt then had the bank account where Jimmy had deposited the stolen £100,000 frozen. Holmes returned to the UK, completely unaware of what was happening. When he flew to Jersey, the tax haven where his money was deposited, he found his account was empty. Eventually, he tracked down Oxley, where he confessed that he had switched sides, alleging Hunt had threatened his life if the paperwork was not handed over. Shortly after this conversation, 2 Greens Court was firebombed, the first stage of an audacious guerrilla war that Holmes had launched against his old partner. This guerrilla war bordered from the audacious to the outright absurd. Renting out a flat in Dublin where he coordinated his campaign, one of the more unusual attacks he launched on Hunt came in the form of leaflets distributed around his Essex village, claiming that amongst other things he was a drug dealer, a nonce, and also ran sex shops selling dildos and gay porn. Whilst Hunt's fax machines whirled as a personal message was copied to his Soho business associates, reading, "Told you that I would get you out of the West End, didn't I? You piffed me off to everyone. Yes, I'm queer, but I'm here." Jimmy had gone to the Time Out magazine, detailing his life in the underworld. He admitted to Hunt's lawyers that he was behind it and dared them to sue him for libel. His solicitors asked him quietly to stop the leaflets and referenced how close the two once were. After this, Holmes sent personal letters to Hunt and his wife where he claimed he had contracted AIDS. Whether this was pure fallacy or truth is unknown. If it was the latter, it might explain, along with his regular drug use, the sheer brevity of his actions, which appeared to be bordering on the suicidal at times. He soon threatened more firebomb attacks on the crowded basements of the Soho properties. It was a tailor's owned by Mark Powell, which was an ex-victim of this relentless guerrilla campaign. Holmes claimed Powell owed him some £15,000. Holmes was his first landlord. At Christmas 1996, Holmes superglued the locks. When that didn't work, he threw bleach over the clothing lines, causing £5,000 worth of damage. Powell reported this incident to police, later decided not to press charges. Yet months later, in March 1997, his shop too was firebombed. A red Ford Escort was seen driving away from the scene, with alert neighbours giving the registration plate to police. The following evening, Gary Oxley took Powell to see Hunt as he agreed to make a statement to the police about Holmes. But just before he did, police told Powell that the car was registered to Gary Oxley. Powell was too scared to say anything to the police. Within a few hours, he was being escorted to a solicitor's firm to falsely incriminate Holmes. Holmes was ready to become a police informant after being falsely accused of the Taylor firebomb attack. He was in talks with detectives who had been observing the unfolding Soho guerrilla war. D.I. John Shatford ran the investigation. His first approach to Holmes in the January of 1997 before the firebomb attack was rebuffed. According to Holmes' own lawyer, his demands were unrealistic. A daring plan was devised by Scotland Yard to lure the East London criminal to Green's Court on the premise of meeting Holmes. Armed officers were to be disguised as prostitutes and punters, but the plan was called off owing to the real risk that officers would end up being brought out in body bags. Whilst Hunt's lawyers pursued a libel case against Holmes in relation to his leaflet dropping campaign, the Longfellow himself had put his associates to work in tracking the rogue gangster down. He had been spotted in Liverpool. Paul Kavanagh, an associate, was a fraudster. Through his very much illegal access to credit card databases, the Longfellow thought he was the perfect man to try and locate Holmes. They discussed the matter over a Chinese takeaway at the Morleys. Unfortunately, Hunt hadn't counted on Kavanagh doing a runner after a botched fraud scam in the Republic of Ireland, with a £12,000 Land Rover he'd lent him. Suffice to say, Holmes had managed to give his old adversary the slip. In 2004, under the pseudonym of Horace Silver, perhaps a reference to his mentor and the closest thing he had to a father, Bernie Silver, Jimmy wrote Judas Pig. The book was eye-opening and sent shockwaves through the London criminal underworld. It's more an autobiography of Jimmy's life, portrayed as the character Billy Abrahams. The latest stage of the protracted guerrilla war was for Jimmy to simply incriminate his old associates in writing, whilst avoiding landing himself in hot water for his part in certain crimes. Jimmy aimed to have Hunt imprisoned or killed through his book, which later extended to a second book, The Charity Committee, released in early 2013 in the run-up to Hunt's libel trial. It was quickly pulled from the market, but not before selling an estimated 3,000 copies, after Hunt's solicitors issued a cease or desist letter on the grounds that the content was libelous. Jimmy vowed to release a third book, to be named The Boy Who Kicked the Nonce's Nest. Unsurprisingly, this book has never reached publication. Jimmy was interviewed back in 2006 for Ross Kemp's LondonUncovered documentary, where he went into great detail about the contemporary British, or London, criminal underworld. Only part of the interview was shown in the documentary, but the full interview is available to view on YouTube, where it has accumulated a substantial number of views. In the video, he talks about how he was involved in torture, as well as operating protection rackets utilising a method called the bullet or the bag. The tactic involved approaching pub landlords and asking them to sell their freehold to him and his firm, the bag referencing a bag of money, or to face a bullet if they did not comply. To some, Jimmy Holmes is an anti-hero. An unconventional gangster who turned his back on the underworld amidst being unable to deal with the pathological violence he was surrounded by. Yet we must remind ourselves that Jimmy Holmes may be just as bad as his former associates, and the violence that gave Jimmy justification for turning his back on this world a mere smokescreen, or at least just one factor in the creation of his new persona. Rather, it may well be the case that money ultimately provided Holmes with a reason to turn his back on his associates and attempt to incriminate them. Jimmy was clearly very bitter about the wrongs he believed to have been committed against him, namely his belief that Hunt had stolen his money. Tit for tat, Holmes ended up stealing £100,000 from Hunt. There may also be the possibility that Holmes felt unable to be his true self around the Canning Town mob in relation to his sexuality. Jimmy's current status is unknown, many believe him to be dead. He stopped posting on a Twitter account in 2017, his last tweets relating to a murder in Islington. He was believed to be in contact with Michael Gillard in producing Legacy, which was released in 2019, so it is reasonable to assume he was alive, somewhere around that time. The 2006 video interview clearly takes place in a house somewhere in a British city, probably London. Those particularly observant will have noticed the email address given to contact the author of Judas Pig changed recently, as did his picture, a photoshopped pig with a Bounty chocolate bar over its head. You can easily infer what this means. There is also a curious reference to Margaritaville, the name of a beach resort in Key West, Florida. On page 162 of Judas Pig, Billy Abrahams writes, "The Florida Keys, a dotted mass of breathtakingly beautiful atolls, which rightfully claim their place as jewels in America's crown. Ernest Hemingway drank himself to death on Key West, and on another, the sinner Jimmy Buffett wasted away in Margaritaville." He also mentions Key West as being the true gay capital of the US. From this, we could infer that Jimmy is still living, perhaps in Key West or somewhere else in Florida. It is interesting to note the automatic response references film rights. Could Jimmy have been wanting to make a film about his life, and invariably that of his associates? It is almost improbable that this story will ever be told on the big screen, at least for the foreseeable future. That said, Jimmy said very few of his associates, himself included, will make old bones. If we can assume his year of birth of 1959 to be correct, Holmes will now be 64. He recalls in the interview the nearest he came to being taken out was when he walked out of a pub in East London and a pillion passenger of a motorcycle opened fire. However, the gun jammed, and so Holmes was saved from death. It is more than probable that if he is still alive, he is abroad, well away from Britain, where he is a marked man with his old associates.